The year was 1939. Across Europe, the world was once again on the edge of catastrophe. Tanks rolled across borders, cities fell under bombardment, and the sky itself became a weapon. World War II had begun, and with it came a new kind of warfare, one fought not only on land or sea but in the air. Airplanes had evolved from fragile biplanes into metal giants, capable of carrying tons of explosives across continents. To generals and strategists, air power meant dominance. Whoever controlled the sky could control the war. But there was a flaw in that vision, a fatal weakness no one could ignore. Bombs could destroy cities, yes, but they could not aim. The problem of precision. When a bomber flew high above its target, it relied on human judgment, mechanical sights, and hope. A gust of wind, a calculation error, or a patch of cloud could throw a bomb miles off course. Military commanders demanded precision. They wanted to hit enemy factories, bridges, and ships, not empty fields or civilians. But no matter how advanced the planes became, no one could make the bombs themselves intelligent. They fell blindly, obeying gravity alone. During missions over Europe, hundreds of tons of explosives were dropped, and often only a small fraction actually hit what they were supposed to. The rest scattered destruction across the landscape. Every missed target meant wasted resources, lost lives, and prolonged war. The Allies needed something better. They needed a bomb that could think, a weapon that could correct its path, follow a target, and hit it exactly where intended. But in 1940, such an idea sounded like science fiction. Electronics were primitive. Radar was still experimental. Radio control systems were unreliable and easy to jam. Even the most advanced engineers could not imagine a way to make a bomb steer itself. At the same time, the military was flooded with proposals, from homing torpedoes to guided rockets, each promising impossible accuracy. Most were dismissed as fantasy, and yet, far away from the battlefields, in a quiet laboratory at Harvard University, a man with no military background at all was about to suggest something even stranger, something so bizarre that it bordered on madness. His name was Burrhus Frederick Skinner, a psychologist who studied how animals learn and behave. He was not an engineer, not a soldier, not even a physicist. But Skinner believed that the key to precision, the solution to the greatest targeting problem of the war, might not come from machines or mathematics, but from the natural world itself. While other scientists built metal and wire, Skinner worked with feathers and instinct. And when he looked at a pigeon pecking at a target in one of his experiments, he saw not a bird, but a pilot. He began to wonder, if a pigeon could learn to hit a target inside a box, could it do the same inside a bomb? It was a question that would lead to one of the strangest military experiments in history. And it would prove, at least for a time, that intelligence doesn't always need a human mind. In the winter of 1940, B.F. Skinner was a man caught between science and war. While Europe was tearing itself apart, he spent his days in a Harvard laboratory studying how living creatures learn. His subjects were simple, rats and pigeons, but his ambitions were enormous. Skinner believed that behavior could be predicted and controlled. To him, a mind was not a mystery but a machine, a living system that could be taught to respond to signals, patterns, and rewards. He called his approach operant conditioning, the science of shaping behavior through reinforcement. A creature, he argued, could learn to perform almost any task if it was rewarded for doing it correctly. Most of his colleagues saw it as psychology. The US military, however, saw no use for it at all. That changed the day Skinner boarded a train during the early months of the war. The spark of an idea. According to his later accounts, Skinner was staring out the train window when he noticed a flock of pigeons flying alongside the cars. They moved with incredible coordination, dipping, turning, and gliding together like a single intelligent organism. In that moment he had a revelation. These creatures weren't just reacting blindly to the world. They were navigating it, adjusting in real time, correcting their own paths, exactly what a bomb needed to do. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching an idea, a bomb that could steer itself not through electronics or human control, but through trained pigeons acting as its eyes. The concept sounded absurd even to him, but as he thought it through, it began to make frightening sense. Pigeons had extraordinary vision, far sharper than any humans. They could recognize shapes and patterns from hundreds of meters away. They could track moving objects even in the chaos of flight. And most importantly, they could learn. Skinner realized that if a pigeon could be trained to recognize a specific target, a ship, a building, a bridge, it could, in theory, guide a bomb directly toward it. He imagined a small compartment built into the nose of the bomb. Inside it, a pigeon would sit facing a screen that projected an image of the target below, captured through a lens. The pigeon's job would be simple: keep pecking at the image of the target to keep it centered. If the bomb drifted off course and the image moved, the pigeon would peck to correct it. Those tiny pecks would be translated into signals that adjusted the bomb's fins, steering it back on target. It was a strange union of nature and machine, a living guidance system, a war for ideas. At the time, the US government was open to nearly anything that might give them an edge. Laboratories across the country were working on secret projects, new explosives, remote-controlled weapons, and even experimental rockets. But Skinner's idea stood apart. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't digital. It was biological. When he first tried to explain it to his colleagues, they thought he was joking. But Skinner was dead serious. He began building a small model in his lab, a crude wooden box with a screen and space for a pigeon. Within weeks, he had results that defied belief. He trained pigeons to recognize photographs of ships, tanks, and buildings. Each time they correctly pecked the image, they were rewarded with food. The birds learned fast, very fast. Soon they could identify specific shapes, even when the photos were turned, cropped, or blurred. They weren't just memorizing pictures, they were understanding patterns. Encouraged, Skinner took his idea to Washington. He called it Project Pigeon. He believed it could change warfare forever. The reaction. When Skinner finally stood before the National Defense Research Committee, a group of scientists and military officials funding wartime innovation, he expected skepticism. But he didn't expect laughter. The generals couldn't believe what they were hearing. "Are you suggesting," one of them asked, "that we build bombs with live pigeons inside?" Skinner nodded. To him, it was logical, elegant, and practical. To them, it sounded insane. The project was dismissed almost immediately. They told him the military needed real technology, not trained animals. But Skinner refused to give up. He went back to his lab, determined to prove them wrong. He built new models, refined his methods, and trained more pigeons, each more precise than the last. He filmed their sessions on camera, documenting how the birds could keep a moving target centered even when the image swayed, tilted, or flickered. The results were undeniable. The pigeons could actually fly the bomb, better than any mechanical guidance system of the time. Still, no one in power wanted to believe it. Skinner later wrote, "The pigeons performed perfectly." The problem was convincing the people. By the spring of 1941, B.F. Skinner's lab had become a place of quiet obsession. The world outside was marching deeper into chaos. Europe was burning, Japan was expanding across the Pacific, and the United States was edging closer to war. But inside that small laboratory, the sound wasn't of gunfire or engines. It was the soft tapping of pigeon beaks on glass. Skinner's vision had taken shape, a bomb that could think, react, and correct itself mid-flight, guided by trained pigeons who understood only one rule: keep the target in the center. He knew that for the military to take him seriously, he needed not just theory, but proof. And so began one of the strangest military experiments in modern history. Building the cockpit. The first step was to design a working prototype of what he called the Pigeon Guidance Unit. It looked simple, even crude, a small wooden box with a translucent screen on one end and a harness for a single pigeon. Behind the screen was a projection of the target, perhaps a ship or a fortress. Every time the pigeon pecked at the image, the box recorded it. If the peck landed dead center, a mechanism would deliver a small food reward. Skinner began with simple shapes, circles, squares, silhouettes of boats. Then he moved to real photographs. The pigeons learned quickly. They didn't just memorize one photo, they generalized. A pigeon trained on one picture of a ship could recognize another from a different angle or distance. Soon, Skinner realized he could teach them complex concepts like tracking. He would move the projected image slowly to simulate motion. The pigeon's job was to follow it, pecking to keep the target centered. And they did, with near-perfect precision. In his notebook, Skinner wrote, "The birds behave as if the picture were real. They do not lose the target. They never hesitate. The pigeons, it seemed, were natural pilots. From one bird to three. But Skinner was a scientist and he knew redundancy meant reliability. So he came up with an improvement. 3 pigeons per bomb. Each bird would sit in its own compartment, pecking its own screen. The bomb's steering fins would respond only when all 3 pigeons agreed on the same correction. It was brilliant in its simplicity, a biological form of consensus-based guidance, long before computers could achieve anything similar. If one pigeon made an error or got distracted, the others would override it. The result was a stable, highly accurate targeting system, powered entirely by trained birds. To prove it worked, Skinner built a simulator, a suspended box that mimicked the motion of a falling bomb. Inside, 3 pigeons sat tracking a moving image projected from below. They maintained their aim even when the platform shook violently, simulating turbulence. When the target drifted, they corrected instantly. Observers were stunned. The pigeons weren't guessing. They were piloting. The secret laboratory. By now, Skinner's small experiment had grown into a full-fledged government project. In 1941, the National Defense Research Committee quietly gave him funding, $25,000, nearly $500,000 today, to expand his research. They called it officially Project Pigeon. Unofficially, some in the office nicknamed it the Bird Bomb. At a secluded facility, Skinner and a handful of assistants built training stations, guidance boxes, and feeding systems. Each pigeon was catalogued, trained, and tested for accuracy. The process was meticulous. Every morning, the birds were given carefully measured rations to keep them motivated for food-based rewards. They spent hours pecking at moving targets, learning to distinguish ships from waves, cities from fields, factories from ruins. Skinner even experimented with different kinds of lighting, motion, and background clutter to mimic real battlefield conditions. He found that pigeons could adapt faster than most people would believe. They didn't panic at motion or noise. They simply kept working. The birds could maintain a lock on a target for over a minute, even with distractions like flickering lights or moving shadows. That might not sound long, but in a falling bomb, a minute was an eternity. The results. By late 1942, Skinner's data was impossible to ignore. Pigeon-guided prototypes hit their targets with astonishing accuracy, often more reliably than the early electronic guidance systems the military was developing at the same time. In one test, 3 pigeons successfully guided a mock bomb directly onto a model ship's centerline, maintaining perfect tracking all the way down. The pigeons had done what engineers and physicists couldn't yet achieve. They gave a bomb intelligence. Skinner was ready to present his findings to the military again, this time with hard evidence, film footage, and working prototypes. He believed the project would finally be accepted. That Project Pigeon would change the future of warfare. He was wrong. In October 1944, Skinner arrived in Washington, D.C., carrying a box that held the proof of his dream. Inside were photographs, training logs, and the small wooden guidance prototypes, each one a strange mix of wood, glass, and feathers. He was nervous, but confident. The war had reached its most desperate phase. The Allies were losing bombers by the hundreds over Europe and the Pacific. Accuracy was a matter of life and death, and he believed he had found a way to make every bomb count. But the moment he stepped into the boardroom, he knew he was in trouble. Around the long oak table sat the men who decided what projects lived or died. Colonels, engineers, and bureaucrats from the Navy and Army Air Forces. They were tired, pragmatic, and deeply skeptical. Skinner placed his demonstration unit in front of them. He explained how each pigeon was trained, how they could steer a falling bomb toward any target with precision unmatched by machines of the time. And then he showed them the footage. Black and white film reels of pigeons pecking furiously at projected images, keeping them perfectly centered even when the screen moved violently. When the film ended, there was silence. Finally, one of the officers leaned forward. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You want us to put live birds inside a bomb and then drop it?" Skinner tried to explain that the pigeons would be unharmed until impact, that they were simply guiding the bomb, that this was in fact a highly effective biological computer. But the room had already turned. Some laughed quietly, others just stared at him with disbelief. To them, it was madness. A weapon guided by birds was not a scientific breakthrough, it was a joke. Within weeks, the project was officially terminated. the US military moved on to electronic guidance systems, radar, and the emerging field of rocketry. For Skinner, it was a crushing blow. He'd poured years of his life into the idea and watched it dismissed in a single meeting. In his private notes, he wrote, "Our problem was not that the pigeons couldn't do it. It was that people could not believe they could." Project Pigeon was quietly shelved. The funding stopped. The pigeons were released. Skinner went back to teaching psychology, his radical experiment, forgotten by all but a handful of scientists, the revival. 2 years later, as the Cold War began to take shape, the idea suddenly came back to life. The Navy's Office of Research and Invention stumbled across Skinner's old files. They were facing a new problem, guiding missiles without radio signals that could be jammed. Someone remembered the strange pigeon experiment. Maybe it wasn't so crazy after all. In 1948, the project was revived under a new name, Project Orcon, short for Organic Control. Skinner was called back. The new prototypes were smaller, lighter, and more sophisticated, complete with automatic feeding systems and improved optics. This time, the pigeons performed even better. They could hold a target steady for nearly 2 minutes, long enough to guide a missile accurately to impact. But history repeated itself. By the early 1950s, new radar and infrared guidance systems made biological control obsolete. Once again, the project was shut down. Skinner's pigeons had outperformed the machines, but technology was moving too fast for anyone to care. In 1953, Project Orcon was officially declared no longer necessary, and so ended one of the strangest scientific endeavours of the 20th century, the time when birds came closer than ever to becoming weapons of war. For most of the world, Project Pigeon was a forgotten footnote, one of many wartime oddities buried under the avalanche of bigger, louder inventions that actually saw combat. But for scientists, it became something else entirely, a turning point. Because even though Skinner's pigeon-guided bombs never flew, the ideas behind them quietly reshaped modern science, in ways few could have predicted. From bombs to behaviour, when the war ended, B.F. Skinner returned to Harvard University. He had lost his military funding but not his curiosity. Project Pigeon had proven something he had always suspected. Behaviour could be engineered with precision, not just in birds but in people. The same principles he used to train pigeons to follow targets, reward, repetition, stimulus control, could be applied to education, psychology, even machines. Within a decade, Skinner published his groundbreaking work Science and Human Behaviour, followed by Beyond Freedom and Dignity. He became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, the father of behaviorism. His operant conditioning, the method he refined while teaching pigeons to fly bombs, went on to shape how teachers teach, how companies motivate workers, and even how algorithms learn. In a strange twist of fate, Project Pigeon had created not a new weapon, but a new science, a hidden influence on modern technology. The logic of Skinner's pigeon control system, 3 independent agents making collective corrections toward a shared goal, later reappeared in fields far beyond psychology. In robotics, this became the foundation for feedback control, the core principle behind everything from autopilot systems to modern drones. In computer science, the concept of reinforcement learning, the way AI learns by trial, error, and reward, traces its philosophical roots directly to Skinner's experiments. And in the military, decades later, smart missiles and guided systems would finally do what Skinner dreamed of, adjust their path mid-flight based on real-time input. Only now, the pigeons were silicon. Even NASA engineers studying automated navigation systems have referenced Skinner's early ideas, calling his pigeon guidance the first analog model of biological computation. The pigeon's final flight. For years, Skinner kept the original guidance box in his office, a small, worn reminder of a time when he tried to convince generals that psychology could guide a bomb. He would later say, half-jokingly, the pigeons never made a mistake, only the people did. In 1961, one of the last surviving prototypes was placed in the Smithsonian Institution. Visitors sometimes stopped to look at it, puzzled by the label, Pigeon-Controlled Missile Guidance System. They often laugh, thinking it was a joke. But to those who know the story, it's a relic of a world on the edge of invention and insanity, where desperation turned imagination into reality. The real lesson, Project Pigeon, wasn't about birds or bombs. It was about belief. It asked a question that science still wrestles with today. What happens when an idea is so far ahead of its time that no one takes it seriously? B.F. Skinner's experiment proved that innovation doesn't always come from machines. Sometimes it comes from looking at nature in a new way. And though the project ended in failure, its spirit lived on in every system that learns, adapts, and makes decisions, from modern AI to self-guided drones. The pigeons may never have flown into battle, but their legacy did,